In my last video covering my East Coast road trip, I talked about how I had the opportunity to take a bonus trip to Pennsylvania towards the end of the summer. During this trip, I had the chance to revisit Six Flags Great Adventure as well as Dorney Park. On the final day of the trip, I also had the chance to head over to the Jersey Shore, where I got to ride some coasters along the beach and on the boardwalk. While these coasters weren't the craziest rides ever built, this final part of the mini trip was the highlight for me. So let's get right into it. While it is well known that Wildwood has Morey's Piers, it is lesser known that Ocean City is home to Playland's Castaway Cove, where the SNS launch coaster Gale Force is located. I knew that if we were headed in that general direction anyway, it would be worth adding an hour to our trip to stop there and get the credits. As we drove closer and closer to the Ocean City boardwalk, what looked like a tiny speck of a coaster soon became a tower of messy blue track. We arrived just before the park opened, so we got to watch the coasters run some test cycles beforehand. It was like 2 or 3 in the afternoon on a Sunday in August, and we were the only people in the park at that point. We headed over to get our tickets for Gale Force and Wild Waves, and waited as we watched them test. I personally love E&F Miler coasters, and I thought it was so cool how the coaster in the park worked its way around itself, with the most minimal clearances being met. Wild Waves finished testing first, so I hopped on for a Zen ride. The coaster didn't have any insane forces, but I got some mild pops of airtime on the drops and some solid laterals on the turns. I actually enjoyed the views of the beach and Gale Force more than I did the ride. When I got off Wild Waves, Gale Force was finally open, so we headed into the station. The whole experience to ride Gale Force was honestly quite bizarre. For one, they didn't allow any loose articles. Anything and everything had to go into a locker, and they wand everyone with a metal detector to ensure that it is done properly. Which, to be fair, good on them for being safe. I would rather have my stuff secured on platform than skyward heading towards the Jersey Shore. What I didn't understand though was that we couldn't request a row. When we got to the station, there was a party of 3 in the front row, so we asked if we could wait for the next train to go in the front. After all, I did just pay $10 for this one coaster, so I want to experience it the way I want. But they denied us the ability to do so and required us that we sit in the middle row, without any reason. So we sat without any fuss, but it disappointed me not being able to get a front row ride. What made it weirder is that we just sat there and waited. And waited. I guess they needed a certain amount of people on the train to send it, so we waited for a few more people to come into the station and fill up the back row before we were on our way. I don't know, the whole experience was quite bizarre if you ask me. Like, we just sat there strapped into this pretty uncomfy seat and restraint for like 5 minutes, and then they finally decided to dispatch us. It was very odd. But anyway, to get to the point of the coaster itself, Gale Force is a powerhouse. The ride starts with a swing launch, where all the launches feel like a punch in the gut as you skyrocket to the top. For the entire duration of the ride, I couldn't tell what was up and what was down. The ride was so disorienting, and honestly, despite the rough start to get on, I loved every second of it. The ride is short, but it is so snappy and punchy that I think if it was any longer, that it would be too much. That's how intense it was. I only got one ride on Gale Force, but I wish I had gotten some more on it, because that became one of my favorite coasters of the entire summer, and I strongly feel that it doesn't get talked about nearly enough in the community. After we finished up with Gale Force and getting some footage, we left Castaway Cove to head towards Wildwood for the rest of the evening. We got to Wildwood around 4 or 5 in the evening, where we walked around the boardwalk and checked out some of the shops before getting our passes to ride. If you're unaware of how Morey's Piers is set up, I'll give you a little crash course right now. Morey's is broken up into 3 piers: the Adventure Pier, the Mariners Pier, and the Surfside Pier, with each pier having a headlining coaster and a few rides to go along with it. For the sake of time and money, we only opted to get enough tickets to ride the coasters, so unfortunately, we missed out on the pretty solid collections of flats that Morey's had. We started out at the Adventure Pier, where we got a near sunset ride on the Great White, a 1996 Custom Coasters International Woody. This was my first CCI, and I was pleasantly surprised by how smooth the coaster was, especially for its age. The coaster was fun, and it had a couple of floater airtime moments, but nothing that absolutely blew my mind. By far my favorite thing about the Great White was its setting. Coming off the lift hill and gazing out to the beach was honestly so surreal, and was a constant theme for the rest of the evening at the boardwalk. We left the Adventure Pier and headed over to Mariners Pier, where they had a total of 3 roller coasters: Rolly's Coaster, Wild Whizzer, and Sea Serpent. Rolly's Coaster, or Raleigh's Coaster, I really don't know how to pronounce it, was a Pinfari Zyklon that had some pretty solid twists and turns, which was pretty cool. But for the life of me, I could not understand why it had over-the-shoulder restraints. It was just a quirky ride with some jank to it, which is to be expected with these older Pinfari models. Afterwards, we headed over to Wild Whizzer, which was a standard SBF Visa spinning coaster. I was disappointed that we hardly got any spinning on it, but you ride these things for the credit. After the SBF Visa, we knocked out Sea Serpent, one of the original Vekoma boomerangs to open in 1984. Now, personally, I despise Vekoma boomerangs. I think they are so uncomfortable, even with the vest restraints, and I don't like the intense G's that they pull, especially going backwards. It completely throws me off, and honestly I feel like I'm gonna die. With that being said, I had heard good things about Sea Serpent regarding how smooth it was. With it being one of the original boomerangs, I had to give it a chance just to say I got the credit. I was pleasantly surprised when I realized that it wasn't as bad as I expected it to be. I was still pretty disoriented from the backwards section, but it was smooth, and that made the experience much more enjoyable. With that out of the way, we were able to head over to the Surfside Pier to get my most anticipated credit of the trip. In my opinion, the best of the three piers was Surfside. Surfside Pier is home to coasters like Great Nor'easter, Doo Whopper, and the Runaway Tram, as well as the park's drop tower, log flume, a water park, and several other flat rides. Honestly, that whole side is stacked with rides, and it's easily the most crowded with guests from what I saw. My most anticipated ride of the entire trip was the Great Nor'easter. This was my first Vekoma SLC, and I had heard so many good things about this ride. Obviously, it is just an SLC, but when people praise it for being a smooth and actually enjoyable ride, it piques your interest. After putting our stuff in a locker, we headed right into the station to get a front row ride on this iconic coaster. My first thoughts going up the lift hill were just how pretty the entire setting was. Not only is the beach just below your feet, but you can also see the other two piers in the distance, giving some amazing dusk views. It was the one time I appreciated a lift hill for being so slow that it gave me plenty of time to take it all in. The next thing I knew, I was headed into the first drop, ripping through the entire layout. I distinctly remember every single inversion trying to rip my feet off, and I couldn't determine whether I enjoyed that feeling or hated it. I don't know what it is about old school Vekoma coasters, but it just feels like they were overly forceful, and by the end of the ride I couldn't feel anything on my feet. It was just such a bizarre feeling, but I did walk away having enjoyed the Great Nor'easter. I tried my best to get plenty of footage before heading over to the next coaster, Doo Whopper. Doo Whopper was easily the weakest Wild Mouse type coaster that I had ever been on. The ride provided no forces, not even laterals on the turns. Between that and the cringe burger joint theme, I was severely underwhelmed and disappointed. But oh well, a credit's a credit. After Doo Whopper, we headed over to Runaway Tram to get the last new credit of the trip. This new for 2019 coaster actually surprised me quite a bit. These zero force coasters are not supposed to be all that intense, and this one wasn't either, but I will say that I got a few good pulls off the drop and in the twists and turns sitting in the back row. My favorite thing about the ride though was the theming. The ride is themed to the tram that runs up and down the Wildwood boardwalk, and it even features the same annoying announcement when guests are in the way of the tram. It put a smile on my face, and honestly, the whole vibe at Morey's really just made me happy. It reminded me of the time before I became an enthusiast, when I would go to the local fair as a kid and just take in the atmosphere. Although this park doesn't have any space for new attractions, they keep finding new ways to improve the guest experience overall, and I really appreciate that about parks. I definitely look forward to getting back to the Jersey Shore someday to get more credits and spend more time at the parks to take it all in. The final ride counts are as follows: 1 on Wild Waves, 1 on Gale Force, 1 on the Great White, 1 on Rolly's Coaster, 1 on Wild Whizzer, 1 on Sea Serpent, 1 on the Great Nor'easter, 1 on Doo Whopper, and 1 on Runaway Tram. So what are your thoughts on the coasters of the Jersey Shore? Do you think they are worth a trip? Which one is your favorite? Let me know down in the comments. With the ending of this video, East Coast in 2022 has finally come to an end. In 2023, I hope to get out to more parks and document my journey for those too, so stay tuned to the channel for those coming out in the future. With that, I'm Sean from East Coast Amusements, and I'll see you guys in the next one.